Sheryl Crow was one of the biggest musical forces in the 90s. She had major crossover country rock and alternative hits that paved the way for superstars like Casey Musgraves. But the singer-songwriter who has spent so much time in the spotlight has been noticeably absent in recent years. So what has Sheryl Crow been up to? And will she ever make her comeback? Sheryl's first big break came back in the 80s when she performed with Michael Jackson on his tour. But what should have been a life-changing opportunity she'd cherish forever turned out to be an early sign that maybe the music industry wasn't all it was cracked up to be. Sheryl allegedly remembers a music executive named Frank DeLeo harassing her and even threatening her if she ever spoke out against him. This was way before the Me Too movement. Sheryl said that this event made her fall into a deep depression, which really makes you wonder if her whole career has been in the shadow of that darkness. But instead of letting it consume her, Sheryl found a way out through her music and creative expression. She said the music gave her soul air to breathe. By 1996, her career had exploded with her self-titled album that won 2 Grammy Awards. She was famous and successful, but that also meant being a celebrity. And even though this is something that every artist dreams of, there are also some serious strings attached that aren't always great. The pressure of being a celebrity and trying to stay relevant in the constantly changing world of popular music began to weigh heavily on Sheryl, and it really impacted her mental health. She even considered checking into a mental hospital at one point, but she didn't do it because she didn't want it in the paper, which is honestly really devastating to hear. She wanted to get help but felt like she couldn't get it. Fortunately, she was able to quietly check into the Mount Sinai Hospital in New York City in the end. But this was an early example of her need to step out of the spotlight to keep her sanity. Still, this was far from the end of the long road in Sheryl Crow's career. In 2006, just days after her former fiancé, professional cyclist Lance Armstrong, ended their engagement, which is already troubling enough, Sheryl was diagnosed with breast cancer. She said that when she got diagnosed, she refused to let herself play or write any music for a year. She'd been on the go for so long and needed to take a breather to really evaluate this major life change and figure out how she was going to get through it. She was ready for a change in more ways than one. After residing in Los Angeles for roughly 2 decades, Sheryl moved to Tennessee for a simpler life. She built a music studio in her home above a horse stable, which honestly sounds like something out of romantic comedy. In her 2022 autobiographical documentary eponymously named Sheryl, she was able to pull the curtains back on the years of her career and correct some misconceptions. Sheryl said it was her manager's idea to make the documentary to tell her story and let people know what she'd been up to. Sheryl said that many people out there have preconceived notions about who she is just because of some songs with happy-sounding melodies and lyrics. But there's a lot more to her story than that. There's a real woman behind it all. Specifically, a woman in a business that's run by men who often have bad intentions, as she unfortunately learned at the very beginning of her career. Sheryl has weathered all kinds of shifts in the music industry and has always been a little bit of a round peg in a square hole. During the gritty 90s grunge explosion, her music was polished and catchy. When Britney Spears and other female pop stars were rising to prominence, she was releasing catchy, straightforward songs like Soak Up the Sun. She never tried to chase any trends or even stay a step ahead of them. She was always just being true to herself. But when that's always a little bit out of step with your industry, that can be exhausting. Her music label must have been exhausted too, because after she released her 2008 album Detours, she was dropped by them. Nowadays, when Sheryl looks back at that, she says that the experience left her feeling wounded, but also liberated. She knew that her best work was ahead of her, which was a pretty big claim to make considering the massively successful work she'd put out up until that point. In 2019, Sheryl Crow released Threads, which she refers to as her final album. But she's not done making music yet, even if she's out of the spotlight. She actually made 3 new songs for her documentary soundtrack. She knows the world is changing in so many ways, and so is how people release and consume music. So she's letting go of trying to chase trends or keep up. She's just going to keep on being herself because it seems to have worked out well enough so far. Nowadays, Sheryl already has a new project to really invest all her energy in, and it sounds much more rewarding than the music industry. Sheryl is putting her focus into being a good mother to her children, Levi, who is 11, and Wyatt, who is 14. During an interview with the New York Times, she even paused what she was doing to help Wyatt with a piano lesson. She's really gone above and beyond for her kids. She even chaperoned a trip to Washington with Wyatt, and this apparently brought back memories of all the accomplishments she had beyond music, like testifying before Congress about copyright and the environment, or performing with Stevie Wonder at the opening ceremony for the monument to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Sheryl says she's now at the point in her life where her kids don't know who she used to be. She apparently likes to think that she was once famous, but isn't really anymore. This is something that she kind of took control of when she moved away from Los Angeles and stopped dating famous high-profile men like her disgraced cyclist ex-fiancé. Many of Sheryl's peers, including titans of music like Bob Dylan, the Rolling Stones, Willie Nelson, and Stevie Nicks, have been major supporters of her and her music, even after she stepped away from the spotlight. Stevie admits that Sheryl doesn't get the credit she deserves, and when Stevie Nicks says you need more credit as a female singer-songwriter, you must have one incredible legacy. But Sheryl doesn't need to keep chasing being famous for her songs to live on. Her music made such a huge impression fashion in the 90s that it will forever be a part of popular culture. Sheryl's documentary also examines how, despite the misogyny and setbacks that she was up against, she never gave up. Although it may seem like eventually she got tired of struggling when she could have had an easier life, there's a big difference between giving up and moving on, because the second one was done on her own terms. Sheryl looks back on those hard times now and says that she can finally see herself just as a person and not an artist working for a company. She hopes that young women looking up to her now can use her as a template to better understand the business, and to know that you can just keep going and being yourself as long as you stay fearless and creative and curious. At this point, no one really knows if Sheryl will ever come back with another album or a huge stage production around the world. She certainly has the catalog of musical hits and the stage presence to pull it off, even at the age of 61. But whatever she does, she'll do it her own way, at her own pace, because that's how she's always done things. But what do you think? Did you watch Sheryl's documentary? And do you think she should do a reunion tour?